A detective made a promise to a cold case file. 43 years later, he kept it. It's 2017. A detective named Matt Hutcherson sits down at his desk in Sunnyvale, California, and pulls a file out of storage that has not seen serious daylight in years. The folder is worn. The paper inside has yellowed. The case number tells him this file is older than he is. He opens it, and the first thing he sees is a photograph of a 15-year-old girl. Bright smile, the kind of look on her face that tells you she had no idea what was coming. Her name is Karen Stit, and according to the file in front of him, she has been dead since September of 1982. Hutcherson doesn't know it yet, but this file is about to become the defining case of his career. He doesn't know that it will take him 5 more years to crack. He doesn't know that the answer, the actual living, breathing person responsible for what happened to Karen, is not hiding in the Bay Area where she died. He's on a beach, in Maui, living a quiet life 2,500 miles away from the cinder block wall where Karen's body was found 3.5 decades earlier. But Hutcherson doesn't know any of that yet. All he knows sitting at that desk in 2017 is that a 15-year-old girl was murdered, that the case went cold, and that nobody has been held accountable. So he makes himself a promise. He's going to find out who did this, no matter how long it takes. I want you to hold on to that moment, because everything that follows in this story, every piece of forensic science, every quiet years-long stretch of patient investigation, every emotional gut punch along the way, leads back to a detective who looked at a 40-year-old file and refused to let it stay forgotten. On August 2nd, 2022, that promise gets kept. Police walk up to a house in Hawaii and arrest a 75-year-old man for a murder he committed when he was barely out of his 20s. How they got there, and who Karen Stit actually was before any of this happened to her, is what we're going to walk through together right now. If you're new here, welcome to the Crime Daily series. This one is a little different from what we usually cover. It's not just a tragedy, it's a story about persistence actually paying off. Hit subscribe so you're here for more cases like this one, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Let's get into Karen's story. Before we go any further, I want you to know who Karen Stit actually was, because it is far too easy in true crime storytelling to let a person become a case number. I don't want to do that to her. Karen Anne Stit was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. At some point during her childhood, her family relocated, and by her teenage years, she had moved to California to live with her father in Palo Alto. If you know anything about Palo Alto in the early 1980s, you know it was a place absolutely electric with possibility. Silicon Valley was just beginning to become Silicon Valley. The personal computer revolution was taking shape in garages and office parks not far from where Karen lived. It was a region full of promise. For the tech industry, sure, but also just for ordinary families building ordinary lives. Kids rode bikes. Teenagers took buses to see their friends. The future felt wide open. Karen was a student at Palo Alto High School, and by every account from the people who knew her, she was exactly the kind of person you'd want your friend, your sister, your daughter to be. Spunky. That word comes up again and again when people describe her. Intelligent. Full of life. She had a bright smile that people remembered decades later. She loved listening to music. She loved spending time with friends. People like Tracy Lancaster, who stayed close to Karen's memory for years afterward. She had a sister, Suzanne, and an aunt named Robin Morris, both of whom would go on to carry her memory forward for the rest of their lives. Karen also had a particular kind of confidence that I think is worth highlighting. She knew the Bay Area bus system like a local. If you've ever lived somewhere with public transit, you know that's its own small kind of independence. She could get herself where she needed to go. And in the summer of 1982, where she needed to go a lot of the time, was Sunnyvale, because that's where her boyfriend lived. It wasn't far, a bus ride down El Camino Real, one of the main arteries running through that part of the Bay Area, connecting Palo Alto to Sunnyvale and the surrounding towns. Karen and her boyfriend spent their time together the way teenagers in 1982 did, hanging out, playing video games at local spots, just enjoying each other's company. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would suggest anything was wrong. This was a normal teenage romance, set against the backdrop of a region on the edge of an economic and cultural explosion. Karen was 15 years old, settling into her new life in California, with a boyfriend nearby, and a future that by every reasonable expectation should have stretched out in front of her for decades. On Thursday, September 2nd, 1982, Karen got on a bus in Palo Alto and rode down El Camino Real to see him. It was, by all appearances, an entirely ordinary evening. It would also be the last evening of her life. I want to walk through this night carefully because every detail of it would matter for the next 43 years. Karen arrived in Sunnyvale on the evening of September 2nd, 1982. She spent the evening with her boyfriend, hours of conversation, of simply being together, the kind of low-key evening that defines countless teenage relationships. There was nothing unusual about it. Nothing that anyone present would later describe as a warning sign. As the night wore on and midnight approached, it was time for Karen to head home. Her boyfriend walked her to the bus stop. It was on El Camino Real near Wolf Road, a stretch of road that, in 1982, would have looked like a fairly typical late-night suburban corridor. Streetlights, closed storefronts, the occasional car passing through. He said goodbye to her there. He watched her wait for the bus, or perhaps left once he knew she was safely positioned at the stop. Accounts of exactly how the goodbye unfolded would become part of what investigators carefully pieced together in the years that followed. That was the last time anyone who knew Karen Stit ever saw her alive. She never made it home that night. And for the hours that followed, hours that remain even now only partially reconstructed, something happened to Karen Stit somewhere along that route, somewhere in the dark stretch between a Sunnyvale bus stop and the rest of her life. The next morning, September 3rd, 1982, a delivery driver was making his early rounds. It was the kind of mundane, routine task that happens every single morning in every city in the country. Trucks moving before sunrise, drivers following the same paths they follow every day. But on this particular morning, near a business along that same stretch of road, the driver noticed something behind a low cinder block wall. He stopped. What he found was Karen's body, partially concealed, left in a place where under different circumstances, it might have gone unnoticed for longer than it did. I think about that delivery driver sometimes, an ordinary person doing an ordinary job, who became, without any warning or preparation, the person who discovered one of the most painful tragedies a community can experience. Authorities arrived within what was likely a very short window of time. The Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety responded to the scene, and what had been, just hours earlier, a quiet stretch of road that thousands of people drove past every single day without a second thought, became something else entirely. A crime scene. One that, though absolutely nobody standing there that morning could have known it, would remain open, unresolved, and aching for the next 43 years. For Karen's family, the news arrived the way these things always do, without warning, without time to prepare. Her father, her sister Suzanne, her aunt Robin Morris, her close friends, people like Tracy Lancaster, her boyfriend, who had walked her to that bus stop just hours earlier, with no idea it would be the last time he ever saw her. Karen was 15 years old. She had just started high school. She had dreams that were, by definition, just beginning to take shape. And now all of that had been taken from her, and from everyone who loved her, in a single night along El Camino Real. The investigation that followed would be thorough, it would be determined, and for a long, long time, it would not be enough. In the days immediately following Karen's death, the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety responded with what records would later describe as one of the most thorough initial investigations the department had conducted for a case like this. Detectives worked around the clock. They spoke with everyone who might have information, people who lived near the bus stop, passengers who had been on late-night buses along that route, local residents who might have seen or heard something out of the ordinary. The area was canvassed extensively. Evidence was collected carefully. Fingerprints were taken wherever they could be recovered, and biological evidence from the scene was preserved, a decision that, though nobody fully understood it at the time, would become one of the single most important choices made in this entire case. I want to pause on that point, because it matters enormously for everything that comes later in this story. In 1982, DNA technology was not what it is today. It was barely in its infancy as an investigative tool. Most departments weren't using it at all. Most investigators had no concept of what it would eventually become capable of. And yet, someone in that department made the decision to preserve the biological evidence anyway, to store it carefully, to treat it as something that might matter someday, even though someday was, at that point, an entirely unknown and unknowable future. That single decision is the reason this case was ever solved at all. But in September of 1982, investigators didn't have the tools of 40 years later. They had witness statements, they had timelines, they had physical clues that required human interpretation rather than laboratory certainty. And as is standard procedure in cases like this, one person came under early and understandable scrutiny: Karen's boyfriend. He was, after all, the last person known to have seen her alive. That alone makes someone a person of interest in any homicide investigation, regardless of how innocent they may ultimately turn out to be. Investigators needed to understand the timeline of that evening in detail, and he was the person who could provide it. He cooperated fully. He gave detectives a complete account of their evening together, the time they spent at his home, the walk to the bus stop, everything he remembered about saying goodbye to Karen that night. He maintained his innocence from the beginning, and he would continue to maintain it for years. I want to be very clear about something here, because it matters for how this story unfolds. Decades later, when forensic science finally caught up to this case, Karen's boyfriend would be fully and definitively cleared by DNA evidence. The scrutiny he faced in 1982 was standard investigative procedure, not an accusation that stuck, and not something that should define how this part of the story is remembered. He was a grieving young man who lost someone he cared about, and he cooperated with investigators throughout an extraordinarily difficult process. But in those early weeks and months, despite the department's thorough work, no clear suspect emerged. The case generated real attention across the Bay Area. Newspapers covered it, local television stations reported on it, and the community hoped, the way communities always hope, for a quick resolution. That resolution did not come. As weeks turned into months and leads dried up, the investigation gradually slowed. Resources, as they always must in active police departments, shifted toward newer incidents requiring immediate attention. By the mid-1980s, Karen's case had become what law enforcement formally calls a cold case. The file remained open. It stayed in the department's records, carefully stored, a permanent reminder of an unsolved tragedy that nobody on that force had forgotten, even as the active search for answers came to a halt. For Karen's family, there was no such thing as moving on. Her ashes were later spread by her sister Suzanne over Mount Tamalpais in Mill Valley, a quiet, beautiful spot that, in the absence of answers, perhaps offered some small measure of peace. But the questions remained, and they would remain unanswered for nearly 2 more decades before science offered even the smallest crack of progress. I want to pause here for a second, because I think about Karen's boyfriend a lot in this story, a teenager who lost someone he loved and then had to carry the weight of suspicion for years before science finally cleared his name. If you're moved by that part of the story, drop a comment and let me know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, because what happens next in this case is genuinely one of the most remarkable examples of modern forensic science I've ever covered. Decades are a strange thing to compress into a sentence. The case stayed cold for nearly 20 years is easy to say. It is much harder to actually understand what that means for the people living through it. For Karen's family, the 1980s became the 1990s. Birthdays passed, holidays passed, milestones that Karen should have experienced: graduating high school, going to college, getting a first job, falling in love as an adult. All of it simply didn't happen because Karen wasn't there to experience any of it. Her father carried that weight every single day. Her sister Suzanne kept Karen's memory alive however she could, telling stories to anyone who would listen, making sure the people around her never forgot who Karen had been. The Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety never fully closed the file. Over the years, detectives periodically reviewed it, looking for anything that might have been overlooked the first time, hoping that fresh eyes might catch something the original investigators had missed. But the technology that would eventually crack this case open didn't exist yet. They were waiting on science that hadn't been invented. Then, in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, that science began to arrive. DNA testing became a powerful and increasingly precise tool in criminal investigations across the country. Departments everywhere began re-examining old evidence with new capabilities. In 2000, investigators in Sunnyvale did exactly that. They went back to the biological evidence preserved since 1982, the evidence that someone 18 years earlier had made the wise decision to carefully store, and they ran it through the DNA testing methods available at that time. The results were significant, even though they didn't immediately solve the case. They definitively ruled out Karen's boyfriend as the source of the key biological evidence found at the scene. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it deserves real weight. After nearly 2 decades of having faced scrutiny, of having lived with the knowledge that some people may have wondered about him, science finally, conclusively, cleared his name. That is not a small thing. Restored by the same evidence that had been collected the night everything went wrong. But the 2000 testing came with a frustrating limitation. When investigators searched the DNA profile against the databases that existed at the time, they found no match. No name, no face, no suspect. The case stayed cold. But here's what mattered most about that moment, even though it didn't feel like progress at the time. The evidence was preserved. It was protected. It was waiting. Somewhere in an evidence locker in Sunnyvale, a DNA sample collected from a crime scene in 1982 sat in careful storage through the 1990s, through the 2000s, through the entire first decade of the 2000s, waiting for a kind of science that in 2000 nobody fully understood was coming. Karen's family kept living. They aged. They grieved. They wondered, the way families in cold cases always wonder, whether an answer would ever actually arrive, or whether this was simply how the rest of their lives would go, unresolved, permanently incomplete. They had no way of knowing that in a records room not far from where Karen had grown up, a detective was about to walk in and refuse to let that uncertainty stand any longer. Let's go back to where we started, 2017, and Detective Matt Hutcherson sitting down with Karen Stit's file. Hutcherson had grown up in the Sunnyvale area. He knew the streets where this tragedy had occurred, not as an outsider reading a case file, but as someone with a genuine connection to the community Karen had been part of. He had developed a strong pull toward cold cases specifically, seeing them as a unique kind of opportunity, a chance to bring real answers to families who had been suffering in silence, sometimes for decades. When he picked up Karen's file, he didn't treat it as just another assignment. He approached it with a determination that would define the next 5 years of his work. For the first couple of years, Hutcherson did the unglamorous work that rarely makes it into true crime headlines. He reviewed every single piece of evidence in the file. He reread every report. He looked for any detail that might have been overlooked by investigators working 40 years earlier with far fewer tools. He consulted with forensic experts to determine something critical. Was the biological evidence collected in 1982 and preserved through all the decades since still viable for modern testing? It was. And by this point, the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety had become an early adopter of a groundbreaking forensic technique that was beginning to transform cold case investigations across the entire country. I want to explain this clearly because I think understanding how it actually works makes the eventual breakthrough so much more meaningful. Investigative genetic genealogy combines traditional crime scene DNA analysis with the same public genealogy databases that millions of ordinary people use to research their own family trees. The kind of services where you might submit your own DNA, hoping to learn about your ancestry or find long-lost relatives. Here's how it works in an investigative context. A DNA profile recovered from a crime scene, in this case evidence preserved from 1982, can be uploaded anonymously and ethically into these genealogy databases. The system looks for genetic matches, not necessarily to the actual suspect, but to that person's distant relatives, people who share enough DNA to indicate a family connection, even if they've never met, even if they don't know each other exist. From there, investigators do something that is frankly an extraordinary blend of science and old-fashioned detective work. They build family trees, backward, generation by generation, and then forward again, branch by branch, trying to identify which specific individual in that extended family tree could plausibly be connected to the crime. It is not instant. It is not magic. It can take months, sometimes years of patient, methodical work, ruling out false leads, confirming connections, building confidence in a theory before ever approaching a single person involved. This technique had already cracked open several major cold cases across the United States by the time Sunnyvale's department began applying it seriously to Karen's case, and Hutcherson believed it represented their best chance at finally identifying who was responsible for what happened to her. Then, in early 2019, something happened that gave the investigation real direction. An anonymous tip came in. The tip suggested that the person responsible might be connected to one of 4 brothers from Fresno, California, a city roughly 150 miles southeast of Sunnyvale. In the 1980s, people moved around the state regularly for work, for family, for all the ordinary reasons people relocate. A connection to Fresno wasn't implausible at all. The tip was specific enough that Hutcherson and his team took it seriously and began investigating quietly. They looked into the backgrounds of these four brothers, where they had lived in the early 1980s, whether any of them had connections to the Bay Area, whether any had been in or near Sunnyvale around September of 1982. This phase of the investigation required enormous patience, building timelines from 40-year-old public records, checking residency histories, gathering information methodically, all while being careful not to alert anyone who might become aware they were under quiet scrutiny. At the same time, running on a completely parallel track, the genetic genealogy work continued. Investigators worked with approved laboratories and genealogy consultants, uploading the preserved DNA profile under strict privacy protocols, slowly building out a family tree of genetic relatives connected to whoever had left that biological evidence at the scene in 1982. Two separate investigative paths, one built on a tip and traditional records research, the other built on cutting-edge genetic science, running simultaneously toward the same unknown destination. By late 2021 and into 2022, those two paths began to converge. The genetic genealogy research pointed investigators toward a specific family line, and when they combined that genealogical direction with the earlier tip about the Fresno brothers, the picture sharpened dramatically. One name emerged: Gary Gene Ramirez. At the time investigators identified him, Ramirez was living a quiet life in Makawao on the island of Maui, Hawaii. Records showed he had lived in California during the relevant period decades earlier, time in the Central Valley, with possible ties to the Bay Area that lined up with the timeline of Karen's case. To move forward, the investigative team needed something more than a genealogical theory. They needed confirmatory evidence, something that could hold up not just internal scrutiny, but eventually to a courtroom. They obtained what's known as a discrete sample for comparison. This is typically done through entirely legal means, items discarded in public spaces, for example, which carry no expectation of privacy and don't require a warrant to collect. In this case, a sample connected to a relative of Ramirez helped establish and confirm a high-probability genetic match. In late April of 2022, the Santa Clara County Crime Lab made it official. The DNA evidence preserved from that scene in 1982, the evidence someone had the foresight to carefully store nearly 4 decades earlier, matched Gary Ramirez to a very high degree of certainty. After nearly 40 years, Karen Stit's case had a name attached to it, and that name belonged to a 75-year-old man living quietly on a beach in Maui, who had for the better part of his entire adult life never once been connected to what happened on a Sunnyvale street in September of 1982. A DNA match is one thing. Actually bringing someone into custody is something else entirely, especially when that person is 75 years old, living 2,500 miles away, in a different state, under an entirely different jurisdiction. With the match confirmed by the Santa Clara County Crime Lab, planning for an arrest began immediately. And this was not a simple operation. It required careful coordination between multiple agencies: the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office, federal authorities, and local law enforcement on Maui itself. Every detail had to be handled with precision. Ramirez's age meant that authorities needed to plan an arrest that would be safe and controlled. His location out of state meant interagency cooperation across thousands of miles, different legal systems, and entirely separate law enforcement infrastructures. On August 2nd, 2022, all of that planning came together. Authorities arrived at Gary Gene Ramirez's home in Makawao, Maui, and took him into custody. He was arrested without incident. Think about the span of time contained in that single moment. Karen Stit had been dead for nearly 40 years. Ramirez had built an entire life since September of 1982. Decades of ordinary existence, decades of waking up every morning in a world where nobody knew what he had allegedly done. And then, on an otherwise ordinary day in 2022, that life ended, and a different kind of accountability began. News of the arrest spread quickly through Bay Area media. For a community that had carried this story for over 4 decades, that had watched it fade from active headlines into the quiet category of cold case, the arrest brought a wave of renewed attention. People who had grown up hearing about Karen Stit's unsolved murder, who had perhaps assumed they would go their entire lives without ever learning the answer, were suddenly confronted with a name and a face. For Karen's loved ones, the news landed as something genuinely bittersweet. After more than 4 decades of uncertainty, of wondering, of waiting, of living without resolution, there was finally a specific person connected to the loss they had carried for their entire adult lives. But an arrest does not undo grief. If anything, it reopens it. Karen's family had to relive the pain of her death all over again, even as they began the process of seeking the justice she deserved. Old wounds, the kind that never fully heal but that scar over enough to make daily life possible, were torn open by this new development. Detective Hutcherson reflected on this moment later, and what he said captured something important about why this work matters. For him, it wasn't about personal achievement, recognition. It was about keeping a promise to do everything possible for victims and families who had waited in silence for far longer than anyone should ever have to wait. His work on this case, and on others throughout his career, earned him deep respect within the law enforcement community. Colleagues affectionately came to call him a badass detective, a nickname rooted in genuine admiration for his relentless, patient pursuit of the truth, even when that pursuit took years and required a kind of persistence that not everyone has. But the arrest, as significant as it was, marked only the beginning of the next chapter. Bringing Gary Ramirez to actual justice across state lines after more than 4 decades would require an entirely separate kind of patience. I want to pause here because I think this moment deserves it. A man living a quiet, normal life for 40 years, and then one morning, it's over because somebody refused to stop looking. If that gets to you the way it gets to me, drop a comment and tell me what you're thinking. And if you know someone who'd appreciate a story about persistence actually paying off, send this their way. Let's keep going, because the legal road ahead was its own long journey. An arrest in Hawaii doesn't automatically mean a trial in California. There's an entire legal process that has to happen first, and in this case, it was complicated by both the distance involved and the sheer amount of time that had passed since the original crime. Ramirez was initially held in Maui, while extradition proceedings moved forward. Authorities from Santa Clara County worked closely with Hawaiian law enforcement to coordinate a smooth transfer, the kind of interstate legal cooperation that, while routine in principle, requires careful handling in practice, especially for a case this high profile and this old. By late 2022, the extradition was complete. Ramirez was transferred to California and formally booked into the Santa Clara County Jail. He faced charges of first-degree murder, along with additional allegations connected to the specific circumstances of Karen's death. From the outset, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office treated this case with the seriousness that 4 decades of waiting demanded. Prosecutors reviewed an extensive evidence file, one that included not just the original 1982 investigative work, but the entire documented genetic genealogy process that had led investigators to Ramirez in the first place. That documentation mattered enormously. Genetic genealogy is a relatively new tool in the criminal justice system, and prosecutors needed to be certain that every step of that process, from the initial DNA upload to the family tree construction to the discrete confirmatory sample, had been handled in a way that would withstand serious legal scrutiny in court. The biological evidence preserved since 1982 remained the absolute cornerstone of the entire case. What followed was 2.5 years of legal proceedings, the kind of methodical, sometimes frustratingly slow process that defines complex cold cases making their way through the modern court system. Defense attorneys filed motions, both sides prepared, as is standard, for what could have become a lengthy trial. Ramirez maintained his right to a fair legal process throughout, and the court system moved at the careful pace these cases require. During this entire stretch, Detective Hutcherson and his colleagues didn't simply step back and let the legal system run its course. They continued working behind the scenes, reaching out to potential witnesses, re-interviewing people connected to the case from the 1980s, wherever that was still possible, making sure every loose end that could be tied was tied. The Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety also made a point of keeping Karen's family updated on developments throughout this period, while respecting the legal constraints that necessarily limited what could be shared publicly. For Karen's loved ones, her father, her sister Suzanne, her aunt Robin Morris, and the close friends who had carried her memory for 40 years, this stretch of waiting carried a particular emotional weight. The arrest had finally given them a name after 4 decades of unanswered questions. But true closure, the kind that actually allows a wound to begin healing, would only arrive when the legal case reached its conclusion. They attended hearings when they were able to. They drew strength from each other, and from the simple knowledge that so many people, a detective, an entire department, a prosecutor's office, forensic teams across multiple agencies, had worked tirelessly for years on Karen's behalf. Then, in early 2025, the waiting reached its turning point. On February 24, 2025, Gary Jean Ramirez appeared in Santa Clara County Superior Court and entered a plea, no contest, to first-degree murder. In legal terms, a no-contest plea means the defendant does not formally admit guilt, but agrees not to contest the charges, accepting the consequences exactly as if he had been convicted at trial. As part of the agreement, the additional charges connected to the case were dropped. For Karen's family, and for the broader community that had followed this story for so long, the plea meant something significant. It spared everyone from a full trial, a process that after more than 4 decades of waiting could have been deeply emotionally draining for a family that had already carried so much. It also meant the case could finally move toward its final chapter, sentencing, and whatever measure of closure that might bring. The sentencing hearing took place on May 12, 2025, before Judge Hanley Chu in the Santa Clara County Superior Court. By this point, Gary Ramirez was 78 years old. The courtroom was filled with people who had come to support Karen's memory, family members who had traveled to be present for this moment, some of whom had waited their entire adult lives for exactly this day to arrive. They had the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements. And I want to spend real time on this, because I think these moments matter more than almost anything else in a case like this. Karen's sister Suzanne spoke. She talked about the sister she had lost at such a devastatingly young age. She described an emptiness that had lingered for decades, not the kind of grief that fades with time, but the kind that simply becomes part of how you live, a permanent companion you learn to carry. She spoke about the milestones Karen never got to experience, the birthdays, the graduations, the adult life that should have been hers. And she spoke about relief, the specific, complicated relief that comes from finally knowing the person responsible for taking her sister would face actual consequences after 43 years of nothing. Other family members and close friends shared similar reflections. They talked about how this case had shaped their lives, not just the loss of Karen herself, but the decades of uncertainty that followed, the way an unsolved murder can sit in the background of an entire family's existence, quietly present at every holiday, every milestone, every quiet moment of remembering. And throughout these statements there was something else present too, genuine gratitude, toward Detective Hutcherson, toward the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety as an institution that never fully closed this file, even through years when there was no realistic path forward, toward the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office, toward the forensic teams whose careful, patient work with genetic genealogy made this entire breakthrough possible. Judge Chu addressed the courtroom with what witnesses described as genuine gravity. He acknowledged the senseless nature of the crime, a 15-year-old girl, killed for no reason that could ever justify it on an ordinary night in 1982. He spoke to the profound, lasting impact this had on Karen's family and on the broader community that had followed this case for over 4 decades. Considering Ramirez's age and the terms of the plea agreement, Judge Chu imposed the maximum sentence available under the circumstances, 25 years to life in state prison. Given Ramirez's age, 78 at the time of sentencing, this sentence effectively guaranteed that he would spend the remainder of his life in custody. For Karen's family, and for everyone who had worked on this case for years, this sentence represented something that had felt, for a very long time, almost impossible to imagine. Justice, arriving decades late, but arriving nonetheless. I want to be careful with how I frame this, because I think it matters. This wasn't about revenge. Nobody in that courtroom was seeking vengeance. What they were seeking, what they finally received, was accountability. A formal, legal acknowledgement that what happened to Karen Stit mattered, that it was never forgotten, and that someone would answer for it, even after 43 years. In the months following the sentencing, this story reached an even wider audience. ABC News featured the case in their long-running series 2020, in a segment titled Badass Detective. a direct nod to the nickname Hutcherson had earned within law enforcement circles. The episode highlighted his dedication to this case specifically, the broader power of investigative genetic genealogy as a tool, and the emotional journey Karen's family had endured across more than 4 decades. It aired in early 2026, and it brought a renewed wave of national awareness to a case that had, for most of its existence, been known only within the Bay Area. The coverage underscored something important, something I think is worth saying directly. Cold cases are not forgotten. With persistent scientific advancement, and with investigators willing to commit years of their careers to a single file, answers can still come. Even after 4 decades. Even when it feels reasonably like too much time has already passed. I want to close this story by stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. Karen Stit's case is far from the only one that investigative genetic genealogy has solved. Since this technique became more widely used in the late 2000s, hundreds of cold cases across the United States have been resolved using exactly this combination of preserved biological evidence and modern genetic science. Hundreds of families who had, in many cases, almost given up hope of ever receiving answers. For the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, the resolution of Karen's case reinforced something that I think defines good police work at its best, a commitment to never fully closing the door on an unsolved case, no matter how many years pass. Detective Matt Hutcherson, now recognized across law enforcement for his work on this case and others, continues to inspire investigators elsewhere to keep pursuing truth, regardless of how much time has gone by. And for Karen's family and friends, for her father, her sister Suzanne, her aunt Robin Morris, and the close friends who carried her memory for 43 years, the conclusion of this legal process brought something they had wondered, for decades, if they would ever actually experience. A quiet sense of resolution. The pain of losing Karen will never fully disappear. That is simply the nature of this kind of loss. But knowing that justice was finally served after everything gave them a measure of comfort that 4 decades of silence had never been able to provide. Karen Anne Stit deserves to be remembered for more than the tragedy that ended her life. She was bright, she was spunky, she was kind, she loved her friends, she loved music, and she was, by every account from the people who actually knew her, fully and vibrantly alive. Her story is a reminder of how important it is to cherish the people around us, to support families who are living through the unimaginable, and to keep investing in the tools and the people who help bring answers to light, even when it takes far longer than anyone would ever want. In the end, after more than 42 years, a heartbreaking chapter finally closed, not with fanfare, with quiet dignity, built on careful science and on the unwavering dedication of people who simply refuse to forget. Thank you for spending this time with Karen's story. Cases like this remind us what's possible when persistence and scientific progress come together in service of real justice. If you're interested in learning more about cold case resolutions or how forensic science continues to advance, let me know in the comments. I'd be glad to cover more stories like this one. If this video helped bring awareness to Karen's memory or gave you a clearer picture of how cases like hers get solved today, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories that matter. Respectfully, rest in peace, Karen. Your light continues to inspire.